Hello there everyone, I'm uxwbill, taking you along for the ride today on a heating and air conditioning related service call. That's right, it's just related. It's not an actual heating or air conditioning system that's failed, but it is something that's important to the health of one. So let's go into this crazy old building here, take a look at it. Yeah, it's really dark in here, and there have been wasps buzzing around in here. Stuff like that. Yeah, you can't hardly see anything. Which is probably just as well. Oh, there's some cool stuff up here. Like a big old elevator mechanism that you can't even see. But up here in this part of the building, there are two air conditioning condensing units. I don't know why these were put here. I suppose it was just a matter of convenience. Maybe a lot easier to put them here than putting them up on the roof. I was here a couple weeks ago because there's no way for these units to get any form of outside air. They are entirely dependent on this furnace fan right here that is operated by a temperature and humidity driven control. That control had failed, which left this motor unable to run. The temperature in here was absolutely incredible. I'm surprised that these things hadn't gone out on thermal overload or something, because it was so stiflingly hot in here. Can't have been good for these old units either. The head pressure must have been absolutely off the charts. But I got them a new control, got them up and running. Everything seemed to be fine, but here we are a couple weeks later. I did check this at the time. Even though there's a stiff breeze blowing through here, this motor is still piping hot. It's almost too hot to touch. It's not as hot as it was a couple minutes ago, but something's definitely amiss here. And I don't think it's in the wheel itself. That thing ran as smooth as butter a couple weeks ago. I don't know what got to it, but something sure did. There's a roughness in the bearings now. So let's get this thing down and out of here so I can actually see it and work on it a little bit better than I otherwise could. I don't think there's much to getting this down. Probably just these two screws right here, this one and another one over here. And then we'll have this thing out and I can actually take a closer look at it. If it does need a motor, I don't know that I've got one that'll work as a replacement. Let's get it down from there first. And there's the opening where the blower wheel and motor assembly goes. Could have been the weather that did it in. It's not really afforded any kind of protection from the elements, unfortunately. And if there's one thing it's been doing plenty of here lately, that would be raining. Now that I've gone and gotten an actual camcorder, you should be able to hear me, although it would probably be an improvement if this video had no soundtrack whatsoever. I'll tell you what, I don't know what it is with Apple, iPhones, and audio recording, and why apparently they seem to have used a cookie instead of a microphone to pick up sound, but it's just something that they haven't been able to get right for some reason or another. Hardly the point of this video, though. I've got this blower wheel and assembly out where I can actually work on it and see what I'm doing. So I guess we'll see if there is actually any sign of anything rubbing in here, and I don't think there is. It's got to be the bearings in the motor. And speaking of the motor, I don't think that this is the original motor. There's a substantial clue in the form of this particular lead set. This is here so that you can unplug it and actually reverse the direction of the motor's rotation if your application calls for doing such. There's also a designation on the motor right here that you can barely see around the belly band. It says HVAC service parts. We're your source for parts. And it is a Chinese made motor, but I'm inclined to give it a little bit of a break and not actually blame this on the typical level of Chinese quality control, because let's face it, this thing has been exposed to temperature extremes and the elements for heaven only knows how long. So let's just get it apart and confirm my suspicions and see if I've got a motor that'll actually replace it, or if I'm going to have to go to a parts house and get a replacement motor there. I think I've probably got something in my junk pile of blower wheels that would work. Oh, zip ties, you just gotta love them. There we go, a little bit of WD-40 works wonders every time. Oh yeah, that's definitely got a bad bearing in it. Bring the camcorder up a little closer so you can hear. Yeah, they're not supposed to sound like that. I've never seen a belly band quite like this before either. Hopefully I've got something that'll actually bolt up to that. Or something I can adapt, or I don't know. There's a date of manufacture in there. See if that might shed some light as to how long this motor lived. Of course, this is one of these things that's going to require 800 hands to do. Or maybe that. Well, it's definitely not the original motor. There's the model number on it. And then over there's a little wiring diagram to tell you how to do everything up, including something that explains the rotation, which end you're supposed to look at it from. One of my instructors, when I was taking the HVAC classes and going through the program, actually said there's a lot of young kids today that don't understand what the terms clockwise and counterclockwise mean because they've never actually seen an analog clock in operation, and that's a little bit of a sobering thought, isn't it? It makes you feel kind of old. But it also makes you feel a little bit smarter, too, if you ever come across somebody who's got that problem. But there's our date of manufacture. Probably the 8th week of the year 2007, so let's say that it was in the distribution channel for, oh, I don't know, 6 months to a year. So they probably got, what, 11 years out of it? That's not too bad, especially considering that this thing was exposed to the elements. But now I've got to see if I've got something that'll actually fit this truly peculiar mounting arrangement. Oh, yeah, I also want to test this capacitor because its harrowing experience when this motor went bad could have damaged it. I don't know how many hours it went before someone finally noticed and cut power off, or how many times the motor might have bounced off of its built-in thermal protection. Now, a multimeter test is really not the best way to do this because, again, it doesn't test the capacitor under anything like full load. So you can have a capacitor that passes the test but doesn't actually work properly under a load. Now, I believe that this is supposed to be what? What horsepower is this motor? 1/2 horsepower. Calls for a 10 microfarad 370 volt capacitor. There are no markings on this capacitor that I can see, but they might be on the other side. So let's just get hooked up here and we'll see what the old multimeter clamp meter has to say. And right away things are not looking too good for this capacitor. Either it's the wrong kind and has been since day one, or it has suffered a severe reduction in capacitance. Well, not only has this capacitor degraded substantially from its specifications, but look at that, it was actually the wrong value to begin with. I believe that would make this particular case, in the words of NorCal Dave, a multiple offender. Even though the value was off, probably by what, about 15%? We'll reveal how bad I suck at math here. Mental math anyways. If I sat down with a paper and pencil, I could no doubt work it out. But even though that value was wrong from day one, this thing really didn't have to do too much. All it had to do was give sufficient phase shift by delaying the electrical current relative to other electrical currents flowing through that motor in order to set up the rotating magnetic field and get things turning around and around and around, which is a very crude explanation of what's actually going on. This thing also strikes me as being a little bit, I've heard people call these bloated capacitors pregnant, and I hate to do that. I hate to use that phrase, but it seems to be particularly fitting. It also looks like there might have been some capacitor juice leakage up here, which is a little odd, because you see this little spot right here, this little welded or soldered looking spot? That's actually supposed to be a weak point where if the capacitor experiences substantial buildup of internal pressure, I'll figure out my phrasing eventually, that's where it's supposed to rupture, so that nothing else will actually go potentially much more violently. But in this case, it looks like it actually started leaking around the terminals themselves. Fortunately, it is a modern capacitor, so it doesn't contain any polychlorinated biphenyls, which are always a wonderful thing to have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. No, they're not, so don't actually do that. Remember, uxwbill is a professional bad example. It looks like we're going to need a motor and a capacitor. I'd really hope the latter wouldn't be the case, but since it is, we'll just have to dig through my junk pile and see if I can find anything, or if I am in fact going off to a supply house somewhere. Isn't it amazing how cables are capable of tangling themselves, even when you'd think that the situation in which they exist would preclude their doing so? How did this possibly happen? I mean, these were hanging in free air, and it's not that windy out here today. I dug around a little bit, and I think I have found a motor that might work, provided the horsepower and rotational speed are correct. This is a blower wheel that came out of a defunct furnace very similar to mine, and I robbed it from a recycling yard just so I could have the parts, including the presumably still good White Rogers ignition control board. Well, I've never tested that, but you can see I've been robbing bits and pieces off of this thing for a little while now, including the control transformer. Let's just see if that motor looks like it might do the trick as soon as I can get it out of there. I've never actually run it, so I'm assuming it's good, but the bearings are definitely in better shape. Time and again, there are certain things that I find absolutely amazing. Take a look at what someone's done here. They've taken the wiring from this replacement motor, and that's exactly what it was. It was intended to be a service part, because this one is also reversible. You'll also note the removable oil caps for the bearings. It's actually intended to be serviced, but you know no one's ever done that. But here we have the original wiring from the furnace connected to that of the replacement motor, and rather than simply stick some crimp connectors on there and plug it into the board as was done from the factory, they clipped the wiring off the old motor, and then they just hooked it up with wire nuts and electrical tape, which would have taken a lot more time and a lot more effort and a lot more trouble. Maybe they just didn't have them on the truck. I don't know. Let's just go ahead and make a quick test of the new motor's capacitor, just to verify that it's still what it ought to be. It would help if I was able to make better contact with it. I'd say that's close enough. Here's a closer look at the replacement motor in case anybody happens to be curious about it. It's a Fasco part. I find it interesting that it's made in Thailand, seemingly by Fasco Motors. Anyway, while it's out like this, I thought I'd go ahead and give it a well-deserved drink of oil. There we go. Now let's see if the whole mess will go back together. I'm thinking this will be a good place right here to mount the capacitor that goes with this motor. There's already a hole here, and there's another one here that's just a little bit plugged up with some crap. But after that, I think it'll fit very nicely there, along with the little piece of pipe strap that holds it in place. Alright, so let's go ahead and have a run up. By the way, this is an extraordinarily dangerous way to go about doing this, just by jamming the wires from the motor into random outlets. Don't try that at home, don't try it at work, don't try it at a friend's house, don't try it at an enemy's house. In fact, pretty much don't try it anywhere. Now when I turn this on, you're probably going to notice that the motor is not only laboring, but it's also pulling way too much current, or over-amping. Let's go ahead and start it up and see whether or not it even works, for that matter. Make sure everything's plugged in here. So what about the problem of drawing too much current? Well, all we need to do is stick a bit of a restriction on the outlet, which just blew away from me here. I'm sure you can see what a profound difference that makes to the load which that motor is operating under. And yes, just to make sure I've covered all my bases, the wheel is definitely turning in the right direction. Don't put too much stock in what you see on screen, because the two different frequencies, the camera shutter speed and the rotational speed of the blower wheel, can beat against one another and cause odd artifacts that make it look like it's standing still or even running backwards. Now that I've successfully murdered everyone who uses headphones in the viewing audience, I guess we'll go put this back. Now, if I were going to be completely honest with everyone who's watching this video right now, if this were strictly for my own personal use, oh yeah, I would have just put cardboard over this with some duct tape as a flow restriction and would have called it good. But there are at least two reasons why I won't. Number one, this is a paying job. Number two, this thing is also exposed to the elements, and cardboard would be about as effective as a fart in a whirlwind at staying in place and surviving many years up there in the upper floor of that building, where it's exposed to all that wind and rain and snow and probably the occasional bird and many other fun things. Truthfully, I'm kind of surprised I didn't find a bird nest in there, but hey, wonders never cease. Of course, all the birds live over here anyway. I know that because they do nothing but poop on my truck all the time. So there's absolutely no point in ever washing this thing, other than when the rain does it. I really don't enjoy working with sheet metal, which may very well preclude any opportunity I have at being a heating and air conditioning installer, but I really don't like doing that either. So I'm going to do it anyway, though. So we'll see about how much we need here. Looks like it's right at 11 3/4 inches, right at the bleeding edge. So I'll probably add about 2 inches to that on either side. We'll see if this scrap piece that I've got here is long enough to do that. Oh yeah, It definitely is. There shouldn't be any problem cutting that bad boy out of there and having enough material. This isn't really ideal. That's the third reason I would have gone with cardboard on this. If I would have had to go and buy the sheet metal, I don't think there's any place I can get that locally. The hardware emporium might well surprise me. But I'll go ahead and get this snipped out of here and wrangled into some kind of acceptable shape or another. I'll have to go to the hardware emporium and get some zip ends or a nut and a bolt or some kind of means by which I can fasten that. And then I'll get it all put together and we'll take it back to where it goes and see how well it happens to work. Now, I'd like it very much if you would pay no mind to the fact that it looks like a distracted epileptic spastic cut this piece of metal out, because as they say, it's not that the dog walked well, but rather that the dog walked at all. At least I think that's how the old saying goes. But I got it, I did it, and I didn't even cut myself, which is remarkable because I should have been wearing gloves when I did this, and well, I wasn't. So now what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and fold over the edges on this, and then I'll work on devising a way to mount it in position so that it will stay in place. You know, doing too much sheet metal work can result in a guy getting the bends. Haha. But there it is. Measure twice, cut once, and it's pretty close to being right. Sort of. Let's just see if it's enough of a flow restriction to make this little motor stay happy. I'll probably have to hold it in place. Friction fit will probably not suffice here. Oh yeah, that's going to be great. There everything is, all wired up, tied up, and ready to go again. I will go ahead and get some electrical tape and insulate these various uninsulated connections before I put this thing back in place, because I have no intention of someone's accidentally lighting themselves up on this thing. There's a closer look at the wiring. I decided to go ahead and run this on the medium-high speed rather than going all out, because that still moves a tremendous amount of air, but it draws considerably less current, and it'll be easier on the contacts in that temperature and humidity switch, which is really more intended to run something like an attic fan as opposed to a furnace blower wheel. And I wonder if that might not have contributed to the demise of the old control. And while I wouldn't call this work that I'm even vaguely proud of, there's how the sheet metal piece went in. It's not perfect, but it'll be enough of a restriction on the flow to keep the current drawing reasonable, as we'll see when I get it put up there. Now, the smart money would make sure that the circuit breaker's turned off before I go and hook all this stuff back up. I should have done that when I took the blower wheel out, but I didn't. It's not really the smartest thing in the world to do. It may not actually end up helping very much, but I decided to bring a light up here this time around. Thankfully, there's also more sunlight coming in than there used to be. There it is, all in place. That little work light actually did help. That's what things look like without any assistance from the iPhone's built-in camera light. So let's get everything all wired up and ready to go again. The power's back on downstairs, everything's hooked up, so let's just see how we do. I'll make sure that both of these controls will in fact turn it on. Got a vibration in there, but I don't know why there would be. So that's temperature. I probably want it somewhere between 100 and 110, just to avoid stressing these condensing units too much. And then over here we have a control for humidity. I should have brought a screwdriver up with me. It's not vibrating as much as it looks like it is. I'm going to call it good though. So as always, thank you for watching, and certainly do feel free to leave a constructive comment if you so happen to have one.